Prior to the 12th century, the church authorities had been content with defining heresy, while the treatment of heretics was left to secular magistrates. But the spread of heresy at the end of the 12th century caused the episcopal authorities to look for some occasion for enlarging their prerogatives. In 1204, Pope Innocent III appointed a papal delegate with authority to judge and punish misbelievers. From this germ sprung the Holy Office, commonly known as the Inquisition. The papacy gradually proceeded in the design of creating a tribunal under its own direct control. Such a tribunal was soon practically instituted. Its leading spirit was Saint Dominic, founder of the Dominican Order of Preaching Friars, but the title of Inquisitor was not yet adopted at the time of his death, in 1221. Saint Dominic, however, is with good reason regarded as the founder of the Inquisition. But later, the Inquisition entered upon another stage under Spanish direction through a specific organization, practically independent of papal or royal control, though acting under the sanction of both church and state. It became the most formidable of irresponsible engines in the annals of religious institutions. The chief author and instrument of this salutary grant was Cardinal Mendoza of Spain, who had seen that, in consequence of the great liberty of past years, and from the mingling of Moors and Jews with Christians, in all sorts of conversation and trade, many things went out of order in the kingdom. With that liberty, it was impossible that some of the Christians should not be infected. Many more, leaving the religion which they had voluntarily embraced as converts from Judaism, again apostatized and returned to their old faith. If their delinquency was considerable, after having kept them long time imprisoned, and after having tormented them, they burned them. If it was light, they punished the offenders with the perpetual dishonor of their family. Of not a few they confiscated the goods and condemned them to imprisonment for life. Cardinal Mendoza might have been an instrument of establishing the new tribunal in Spain, but no author was wanted for that work. Pope Gregory IX, fit successor of Innocent III, had completed in Spain the scheme which his uncle Innocent began. By a bull dated May 26, 1232, he appointed Dominican friars inquisitors in Aragon and forthwith proceeded to confer the same benefit on the kingdoms of Navarre, Castile, and Portugal. 10 years later, in a council at Tarragona, the chief technicalities of the Spanish Inquisition were settled. No inconsiderable part of the Spanish population consisted of Jews, many of whose ancestors had taken refuge in that country or had settled there for purposes of commerce, ages before the birth of Jesus, and their number had been increased from time to time in consequence of imperial edicts, which drove them from Italy. They were the most industrious, and therefore the most wealthy people in those kingdoms, and had possessed great influence. Their learned men occupied important stations as physicians, agents of government, and even officers of state, while the new Christians, or Jews, professedly converted to Christianity, were intermarried with the highest families in Spain. And all this had taken place in spite of the enmity of the clergy, popular bigotry, and the adverse legislation of Cortes or parliaments. But the wealth which procured Jews and new Christians so much worldly influence became the occasion of great suffering. The old Christians, being less industrious and therefore less affluent, were frequently their debtors. Christians, under a cloak of zeal for the Catholic religion, were incessantly embroiling them with the magistracy or stirring up the populace against them. Spanish historian Llorente estimates the number of Jews who perished under the fury of mobs in the year 1391 at upward of 100,000. To evade persecution, multitudes submitted to be baptized. More than 1 million had changed name at the end of the 14th century. In the first 10 years of the 15th century, a second multitude of forced converts threw themselves into the bosom of the Romish Church. They were set under the keenest vigilance of the inquisitors, without being able even to counterfeit any attachment to the Church, whose most grievous yoke they had put on, but which in heart they hated. The Church gloried over the declension of Judaism. In presence of Benedict XIII, antipope, a formal disputation was carried on for 69 days between Jerome of Santa Fe and other converts on the one side, and a company of rabbis on the other. Such a controversy, carried on even in the presence of a half-pope, could only come to the prescribed conclusion. and after seeing all persuasion and corruption exhausted to bring over the Hebrews to his sect, Benedict closed the debate, pronounced the Jews vanquished, and gave them notice of severer measures. The priesthood and populace poured contempt even on proselytes, whom they classified according to their supposed degrees of heterodoxy. Some were called converts, to note the newness of their Christianity. Others confessed to tell that they had confessed the falseness of Judaism. Goaded by the cowardly persecution, a few dared to renounce the profession of a faith they never held, and many resumed the practice of Jewish rites in private. This opened a new field to the zeal of the inquisitors, but the labor of suppressing a revolt so widely spread was more than the inquisitors could undertake without a more powerfully organized system of their own. During the persecutions of the 15th century, while Ferdinand and Isabella made progress in reconquering the Kingdom of Granada from the Moors, and Islam, like Judaism, was declining, the Moriscos, a middle class resembling the New Christians, and not less dangerous to the Church, also challenged the powers of the Inquisition. No other country in popedom was at that time more deeply imbued with disaffection of the doctrines and worship of the Church of Rome. Then in 1477, one brother, Philip de Barberi, a Sicilian inquisitor, came to the court of Ferdinand and Isabella, who were sovereigns of Sicily, to solicit the confirmation of some privileges recently granted to the Holy Office in that island, and, having observed the peril of the Church within the enlarged and united dominions of the Catholic kings, under whose rule nearly all Spain was comprehended, advised the creation of one undivided court of inquisition. The advice was quickly taken. Ferdinand had no scruple. He sincerely prayed the Pope to sanction such a measure, and, swiftly as couriers could bring it, came the desired bull. Isabella could not blame the zeal of priests and monks, for she too was a zealot, but she had brought half the kingdom as her dower, and therefore some deference was due her conscience and judgment, and both in conscience and judgment she desired gentler measures. During 2 or 3 years, her orator and confessor wrote books, and preachers were permitted to publish arguments, and disputants to enter into conferences for the conviction of the Jews. At Her Majesty's request, Cardinal Mendoza issued a constitution in Seville in 1478, containing the form that should be observed with a Christian from the day of his birth, as well in the sacrament of baptism as in all other sacraments which he ought to receive, and of what he should be taught and ought to do and believe as a faithful Christian. The constitution of Cardinal Mendoza and the harangues of the friars were ineffectual, for the Jews knew that the Christians had a sacred book, said to be written by divine inspiration, as well as the law of Moses, and if that book was not put into their hands, they could scarcely be expected to believe a religion whose chief written authority was kept out of sight. That it was indeed kept out of sight was undeniable, and the notorious Alfonso de Castro, chaplain of Philip II, boasted in his book against heresies that there was an edict of the most illustrious and Catholic sovereigns of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, in which, under the severest penalties, they forbade anyone to translate the Holy Scriptures into a vulgar language. The Queen's trial of humanity was ended, but a question of policy remained. The King and Queen had an interest in Spain as well as the Pope, but they scarcely knew how that interest could be guarded if the inquisitors were allowed absolute power over the persons and property of their subjects. Therefore, they modestly requested no more than that some priests nominated by the king should be associated with some others nominated by the Pope, or that the king should name all and the Pope confirm his nominations. The Catholic sovereigns calculated that nominees of Rome would, of course, prefer the rights of the Church to those of the Crown, but they fancied, or they wished to fancy, that priests of their own choice would prefer their interests to those of a stranger. This was an illusion, and therefore Rome made little fuss, and after due correspondence, the Supreme Council of the Spanish Inquisition was constituted to be led by Inquisitor General Friar Thomas de Torquemada. It was hardly possible that there could have been another man so capable of fulfilling the intentions of King Ferdinand by multiplying confiscations and those of the Court of Rome, by propagating their jurisdictional and pecuniary maxims. The Inquisitor General, or President of the Council, exerted an absolute power over every Spanish subject, so that he almost ceased to be himself a subject. He alone consulted with the king concerning the appointment of inquisitors, to preside over all the provincial tribunals. Their functions were considerably restricted, leaving all capital cases and ultimate decisions in the hands of the Madrid Supreme. Seville represented the general state of the people's mood at the time. There, when a company of inquisitors presented themselves, conducted into the city by men and horses which had been impressed for the purpose by royal order, the civil authorities refused to help them. The new inquisitors found themselves unable to act for want of help. Meanwhile, the objects of their mission forsook the city and found shelter in the neighboring districts, and Ferdinand had to issue specific orders to compel the magistrates to assist the new set of officers, ecclesiastic. These orders were most reluctantly obeyed. The inquisitors issued their first mandate January 2, 1481. They said that they were aware of the flight of the new Christians and commanded all the dukes, marquises, counts, gentlemen, rich men and others of the Kingdom of Castile to arrest the fugitives and send them to Seville within a fortnight, sequestrating their property. Crowds of fugitives were driven back into Seville bound like felons. The dungeons and apartments of the convent overflowed with prisoners, and the king assigned the castle of Triana, on the opposite bank of the Guadalquivir, to the new and holy tribunal to be a place of safe custody. Their second edict was one of grace. It summoned all who had apostatized to present themselves before the inquisitors within a term appointed, promising that all who did so, with true contrition and purpose of amendment, should be exempted from confiscation of their property, but threatening that, if they allowed that term to pass over without repentance, they should be dealt with according to the utmost rigor of the law. Many ran to the convent of St. Paul, hoping to merit some small measure of indulgence. But the inquisitors would not absolve them until they had disclosed the names, calling, residence, and given a description of all others whom they had seen, heard, or understood to have apostatized in like manner. After getting this information, they bound the terrified informers to secrecy. This first object being accomplished, they sent out a third monition, requiring all who knew any that had apostatized into the Jewish heresy to inform against them within 6 days. Under the usual penalties, new Christians who had preserved any of the familiar usages of their forefathers, such as putting on clean clothes on Saturday, who stripped the fat from beef or mutton, who killed poultry with a sharp knife, and muttered a few Hebrew words who had eaten flesh in Lent, were to be punished accordingly. 36 elaborate articles were furnished, whereby everyone was instructed how to ensnare his neighbor. Such opportune measures for multiplying victims could not but produce the desired effect. Hence, on January 6, 1481, there were burned 6 unhappy persons, 16 on March 26th, many on April 21st, and by November 4th, 298 in all. Besides these, the inquisitors condemned 79 to perpetual imprisonment, and all this in the city of Seville only. Since, as regards the territories of this archbishopric and of the bishopric of Cadiz in the single year of 1481, 2,000 Jews were burned in person and very many in effigy, of whom the number is not known, besides 17,000 subjected to cruel penance. Among those burned were many principal persons and rich inhabitants, whose property went into the treasury. Fear caused an immense multitude of others, of the same class of new Christians, to emigrate to France, Portugal, and even Africa. But many others, whose effigies had been burned, appealed to Rome, complaining of the injustice of those proceedings, and nothing in the appeals there, anything that could divert Torquemada from the prosecution of his purposes, and therefore he hastened to bring Aragon under his jurisdiction. Ferdinand convened the courts of that kingdom in the city of Tarragona. The king gave a mandate to the civil authorities, compelling them to lend aid to the new officers, and on September 13th following, the Grand Justice of Aragon, with his 5 lieutenants of the long robe and various other magistrates, swore upon the Holy Gospels that they would give men and arms to defend and to enforce the authority of the Holy Inquisition. In the months of May and June 1485, 2 acts of faith were celebrated in Saragossa, capital of Aragon, and a large number of new Christians burned alive. The public was enraged, certainly, but helpless, yet not so helpless but that many awoke to a conviction that, since the inquisitors had resorted to terror for the conservation of the faith, they ought to be restrained by terror in their turn. In the night of September 14, 1485, one of the inquisitors, Pedro Arbues, covered as usual with a coat of mail under his robes, and wearing a steel skull cap under his hat, for he was every moment conscious of guilt and apprehensive of retribution, took a lantern in one hand and a bludgeon in the other, and walked from his house to the cathedral. He knelt down by one of the pillars. His right hand held a weapon of defense, yet stealthily half covered with the cloak. Two men came and knelt down near him. One of them suddenly disabled him on one side by a blow on the left arm. The other swung his cudgel at the back of his head, just below the edge of the steel cap, and laid him prone. He never spoke again, but expired in a few hours. This murder, as might be expected, was well made use of by the priests, serving them to plead the necessity of an inquisition to repress violence, and the inhabitants of the city were instantly overawed by a display of high judicial authority, which they had no power to resist. The intelligence of that murder threw all Aragon into commotion. The powers, ecclesiastical and royal, panted for vengeance, and the murderers were put to a most painful death. The Jews and New Christians trembled with terror and rage. The inhabitants of many towns compelled the inquisitors to cease from inquest, and it was only by means of military force, after edicts and bulls had failed, that the king and pope together could quash 2 years' public resistance. In Saragossa, where the murder had been contrived by a party of chief inhabitants, a consciousness of guilt weakened their hands, and they endeavored to save themselves by flight. Thousands of people deserted the city, although they had no participation in the deed and were everywhere treated as rebels.